there is some consideration as to whether or not gun control could have been a motivation for the Port Arthur Massacre. Tragic firearm loss of life, particularly mass loss of life, is a very emotive and highly effective way for people to very quickly form an opinion that firearms should not be in civilian hands, particularly high-powered weapons. Does that mean that the Port Arthur Massacre was orchestrated by John Howard and or shady elements of the government? Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. To this day, I get many people commenting on the Wasp Files that in their opinion the principal motivation behind the Port Arthur Massacre, if it was orchestrated by shady elements of the government, including John Howard, was gun control and the disarming of the Australian population, particularly of semi-automatic high-powered weapons and the like. I've always been fairly open and responsive to these by suggesting that anyone who studies history, and you should if you haven't, will soon find out that the oldest motivators in the book for any major events that negatively restrict or impact the civilian population is usually power, money, influence and control. In the case of the Port Arthur Massacre, gun control could be considered to be a bonus because if you once again study history, you'll know that there are many dictators and tyrants throughout the world that have firstly disarmed their civilian populations and then murdered them in their millions. Obviously, a disarmed civilian population is much easier to oppress. So removing firearms from a civilian population could of course be a motivation for governments to do so if they had a higher agenda that in essence is the oppression of their civilian populations. To give you some kind of context, there is an estimated 1 billion guns throughout the world globally. And of those, something like 850 million reside in civilian possession. So that's roughly 85% of all firearms existing in the world are owned by civilians. This could put some impact, if you like, or import on the notion that there would be higher powers that would prefer that civilians not have such a possession, a high possession of firearms, including high-powered semi-automatic weapons and the like. With regards to John Howard, who a lot of the commenters have just directly accused of being responsible in the planning and orchestration of the Port Arthur Massacre, I think it's wise to keep in context his political career. So John Howard was elected as our Prime Minister on the 11th of March 1996, roughly 2 months before the Port Arthur Massacre. Then, of course, he had to deal with that tragedy and was then lauded throughout the world as bringing in the toughest and most extensive gun reforms in our nation's history. However, it should be common knowledge, and is not, that the agenda to restrict high-powered semi-automatic weapons and implement nationwide gun control was in the works as early as 1991. There are many parliamentary documents that propose draft legislation for the banning of these type of firearms. It could be argued that the precedent for this were the mass gun crimes that occurred in 1987 in Victoria, which was the Hoddle Street shootings and the Queen Street shooting. And our then Labor Premier, John Cain, implemented banning of semi-automatic high-powered weapons and pump-action shotguns and the like, quite successfully on a statewide level. So I guess this could be considered to have been a test case for the banning of weapons as a direct response to a mass gun crime tragedy as such that occurred in the 1980s. So whether or not you consider that higher forces, including governments and or shady elements of those, being intelligence and perhaps very powerful anti-gun bodies, would conspire to create a situation where you could remove firearms due to a catastrophic loss of life from the use of those, then there is some consideration as to whether or not gun control could have been a motivation for the Port Arthur Massacre, in addition to some of the other motivations that we discussed earlier. As an overarching consideration for this possibility, the United Nations, which is the collective global governing body of all membership nations to maintain a harmonious world, had issued a paper known as Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030, which is publicly available on their website, is in essence a blueprint for a new world, a more benevolent utopian society where there is a lot more balance, there is a reduction in world poverty, starvation, the control of diseases. And pivotal to part of this agenda is the notion of having total civilian disarmament by 2030, ostensibly 5 years from now. Now, as discussed before, we have over 1 billion firearms, the majority of which are in civilian ownership. So how could they, within 5 years, totally restrict and remove that amount of firearms from a civilian population? Of course, there are many controls that have been put in place which are above board, like the ITAR, which is in essence a restrictive trade on cross-border trade and supply of firearms and firearm parts between international countries. But sometimes to achieve an outcome, extreme measures must be taken to, in essence, change public opinion, to get people behind the notion that guns are bad and should be banned and removed from society. And in that case, tragic firearm loss of life, particularly mass loss of life, is a very emotive and highly effective way for people to very quickly form an opinion that firearms should not be in civilian hands, particularly high-powered weapons. With that in notion, there is often, of course, the criticism that the United States of America should follow in the footsteps of Australia and the lauded successes of our then Prime Minister John Howard in banning high-powered semi-automatic weapons, which they are generally termed to be assault rifles, and to enact that kind of control over America. There are some fundamental differences, however. The United States of America has a constitutional God-given right to keep and bear arms. And it's not for personal self-defense. It came about as a means for the population to be able to protect themselves against a tyrannical government. They have many constitutional rights under God. In Australia, we do not. Gun ownership in Australia is a privilege, not a right, and therefore the robust protections that the United States of America has in place to protect their gun ownership, which they vigorously defend, is not in existence in Australia. But getting back to that notion of gun control, whether you agree with John Howard's decision to restrict and ban certain firearms and to put in place some of the most restrictive gun controls in the Western world is really up to your own opinion and your own belief systems. Though the consideration is that with some of the crimes that have been committed all across the world, there are questions that are raised sometimes about the legitimacy of the circumstances of those crimes and the outcomes that they then postulated. Does that mean that the Port Arthur Massacre was orchestrated by John Howard and or shady elements of the government, and including certain anti-gun advocates such as Roland Brown? That's a question that really remains undetermined, but the consideration is there that the old notion of problem, reaction, solution has been put in place in modern societies for generations. The notion that a problem is created, which then gets a reaction from the general population, and then the government comes up with the solution. thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. New episodes will be uploaded every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Feel free to share far and wide, and please see the links to the Dropbox files and information relating to the episodes. Also, without any obligation, please see the Buy Me a Coffee campaign, which helps keep the channel running and also provides profits to my friends who are survivors from Port Arthur who have supported me on this journey. Thank you.